Hello and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the concept known as public opinion. So what is public opinion and why is it important to modern day societies? This is going to be the start of several videos where we're going to be looking at modern concepts in an attempt to construct a facade of reality around what we come to know as modern day being, existence, humanity, and such topics as that. And one of the most important introduction topics to this, other than the short look at absurdity, which was in the previous episode that we just did, is the idea of public opinion. Public opinion is a very central concept, and yet at the same time it doesn't appear to be too well understood. So in this episode we're going to be looking specifically at what a public opinion is, how it functions, how it's crystallized, and the way that the people that are dictating, legislating, or however you want to look at it, public opinion, come to do so. So public opinion, what is it exactly? Well, we've all had moments in our lives where the concept that we had of a specific action, an idea, a place, a person, did not necessarily fit with the actual reality of that thing. You may have gone to a place for the first time and you imagined that the people there would act a certain way. You may have seen a movie relating a group of people, a concept, a place, in a way which did not truly fit with the reality of that existence itself. And because of this, we have to ask the question, why is that exactly? Well, as it turns out, people do not perfectly interact with the environment in which they live, and in a modern society such as ours today, people are pressed to have conceptions and ideas about experiences, other groups of people, places, things that they have never interacted with, may never interact with, and have little to no real exposure on. So, public opinion, just a real brief introduction. Before the rise of democratic movements, before the idea that the individual should partake in grander government affairs and in creating their own destiny, and especially before mass communications, which are an inherent part of our modern society, the individual interacted with very little. You would interact with your farm, with a group of people. You didn't necessarily need to have any conception outside of the actual experience which you were directly relating yourself to. This is called private affairs. Private affairs are separate from public affairs, and public affairs are the interactions that people necessarily need to have with ideas that are beyond themselves. And with the necessity of the individual to partake in the political process, and with the necessity of the individual to know about the ideas which they intend to discuss in the arena of public affairs, comes the use of mass communications. These mass communications, however, are from other people which also have imperfect conceptions of the environment around them, and as such give a sort of trickle-down effect of less and less closeness to reality as it comes down to the person who is being asked to conceive of something which they have never experienced. These different types of mass communications, the book that we're looking at is actually quite old, but even though it's about 100 years old, basically everything it says is still spot on to this day, and yet we still haven't caught on to a lot of these concepts. So it's one of those things that if you haven't heard of it and you don't understand it, there's no way that you can necessarily prepare yourself to be in the best situation, which you most necessarily could be. So because of different forms of mass communications, especially movies, TV, news broadcasts, and visual communications, which we will talk specifically about a little bit later, people are able to be given wholesale conceptions of existence outside of their own existence and form opinions about these things, which must necessarily translate into their opinion of how their government should be run. And the way that this works is through various stories, news articles, pictures, speeches. Individuals come to construct internal pictures. and the internal pictures which the average person has of a concept that they have never experienced isn't a real thing. However, your internal picture of the bad guys out there, the internal picture you have of the terrorists, of Iraq, of Russia, of anything like that, although they aren't real and they are constructs inside your head, they can trigger emotional responses. And these emotional responses can lead directly to action because people generally want to relieve themselves of negative emotional responses and to pursue positive emotional responses. So through the passing down of various types of what we'll call fiction, which is a term that we will need to expand on because fiction isn't necessarily bad, fiction just isn't tangible. So we'll use that. So through the passing on of non-tangible images, an emotional response is created, and the reaction to the emotional response makes an actual physical response, which directly interacts with the environment that the person is attempting to communicate with in the first place. Just because most people don't interact with the grander environment outside of their own personal experience, that doesn't mean that there aren't others that do so. This would be the job of politicians, diplomats, reporters, socialites, the wealthy, different people that would come to be seen as authority figures in their specific spheres. But just because these people are coming directly into contact with the grander environment of which you wish to gain knowledge, that doesn't mean that they don't also carry with them certain preconceptions, stereotypes, privacy concerns, and other things that would necessarily lead them to give you a less than real idea of which you're going to be basing the pictures in your head off of for these less than real events to give a real emotional and then physical response to. So, what is public opinion? We're going to define it here in just a few minutes. So we're going to give a brief overview of some of the different kinds of images and the different kinds of pictures that can be inside of people's heads, how this comes to interact with the person and with their environment, and how a lot of these ideas work. This first part of the episode is going to be mainly laying the groundwork. So if it seems like I'm throwing a lot of ideas out here, just know that in the next two parts we are more thoroughly going to flesh all of this out. I just want you to understand where it is that we're going and what the relationship is between all of these different concepts. There's three major items that we need to talk about real quick before we can proceed with the conversation. Those being symbols, heroes, and the pseudo-environment. So symbol is probably something that you've heard of before. Different kinds of symbols are more or less timeless. The Christian cross is certainly one symbol. The picture of the owl would have been very similar to the ancient Romans. Different symbols are merely image constructs which have a very broad sense of appeal, can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and yet all reflect off of one basic emotion. There are many different words and ideas and feelings that people can have, but the number of emotions that can directly interact with a person are a little bit more limited. And as I stated earlier, there's a very stark difference between the public opinion and the private opinion. The private opinion, again, is how the person interacts with their own life, the direct experiences that they have. A person can't be sitting around all day, well, most people can't be sitting around all day thinking about things that they'll never experience, ideas that they'll never be able to practice, people that they'll never be able to meet because then they would starve, they would get kicked out of their house for not paying rent. So the private life tends to predominate the existence of most people, as it necessarily should, and it takes up a lot of time. So people need to be able to get images that are concrete, simple, and easy to understand so that they can spend the majority of their time putting their effort into things that will actually help them, as opposed to things that will simply consume their time through different kinds of thought processes. So a picture can be in a specific person's mind, and if a picture is widespread enough and has a broad enough low-level appeal, it can become a symbol, and the symbol evokes a specific kind of emotion. However, symbols, especially in the modern age with the mass dissemination of information, can very quickly be subverted, obfuscated, replaced, and redefined. And because of this, symbols are a bit finicky, and they tend to necessarily need to be constantly renovated, replaced, and moved about. And because people prefer concrete to abstract, that it's simpler to think about, a symbol can actually generally transfer into the picture of a person. And this is generally what we refer to as heroes. Heroes themselves are people that have transcended their private life and have become a public figure, and that public figure itself is more of a symbol that evokes an emotion or a broad concept than the actual person who is living the actual life. One good example to kind of boil this down that's directly from the book was Commander Joffrey. Joffrey was in charge of the French military divisions in World War I, and he was supposedly in charge of the Allied forces altogether. Now, if you were a country farmer in central England, if you were a mine worker somewhere in the United States, you had no concept of what the front line was, what the soldiers looked like. You had no real concept of what 10 million people fighting against each other for several years would have been able to actually look like. And because of this, it's easier to focus on a picture which sort of consolidates down a lot of these ideas. And because of the strict control that the Allies and the Axis had over the information that was being spread out, it was easy for each side to see themselves as good or as bad. And so, even though Commander Joffrey was a human being with his own ideas and with his own motivations and things like that, he came to be seen as a hero. The symbol of the picture of Joffrey was seen more as the emotion or the idea of good versus evil, of the triumph of light over dark. And especially in times of war, it's much easier for these symbols to crystallize because people need to sacrifice, and the sacrifice is real to them even though the war necessarily can't be. And the sacrifice demands some sort of reasoning for it. And the reason that they were doing this was because this man, Joffrey, was out somewhere in the distance gallantly defending against the evil Kaiser. So a lot of the propaganda, a lot of the different posters and things would have a single person representing Germany, a single person representing France, and these symbols would evoke the emotions in the different people that were sacrificing in their own countries for something that they had never seen, they had never experienced, and in all truth, they never truly could. Another thing that about the symbolism in heroes, there was a report that Joffrey did sometime near the end of the war, where they came in and they wanted to take a picture with him, but something was off. And they looked around his room and there were no large maps. And when people thought of generals at the time, they thought about them as standing around a map, plotting the different battle lines, doing that kind of thing, but that wasn't actually what Joffrey's job was. So what did they do? They rolled in a bunch of maps, they put them up, they had Joffrey take the picture, and then as soon as they were done, they took them down and they left with them. The symbolic concept of the hero of Joffrey as something like St. George going to slay the dragon in this case being the Kaiser, needed to necessarily reflect the preconceived notions, or as we'll get into a little bit later, the stereotypes of the symbol or the symbolic hero that the people already had in their head. So, as I talked about a little bit a minute ago, these symbols, these pictures, they are fictions. And fiction is a concept that we definitely need to get into at some point, but just briefly, a fiction is not an untruth. Just because something is fictitious, that doesn't mean that it is wrong. A fiction is simply something that's intangible or doesn't physically exist. Generally, in good fiction, there are principles, ideas, and symbols which can transcend the immaterialness and cause an emotional response in the person who goes out and uses that emotional response to affect some sort of change or some sort of action in their greater environment. And so in some sense, the reality of a fiction ends in a physical truth. And so in this case, these fictions of the symbols of the heroes of World War I led to the emotional response of being able to burden the consequences of the sacrifice needed for the war, which led to the physical response of the war continuing. This is, well, to talk about symbols changing, let's contrast World War I with the recent Iraq War in the United States. In the beginning, there was pictures of the Saddam Hussein statue being torn down. There was testaments about the brutality of the Saddam regime. There was a lot of symbols and pictures of the United States going in as glorious liberators and going to free these people. And as symbols, as I've mentioned with symbols, they're easily transmuted or mixed or changed about. When the pictures from Abu Ghraib came out, the idea of people being liberators was suddenly destroyed because there was now this new symbol of the soldiers being there and doing negative things. And even though the soldiers overall, most soldiers in the US military at that point weren't involved in Iraq, and the ones that were, most of them weren't engaging in combat. And once Abu Ghraib came out, most of the soldiers in turn, again, didn't have anything to do with that. It didn't matter because these fictions were inside the people who were influencing public opinion in the United States. And even though these images were necessarily not the truth of the entire reality, they caused an emotional response, which caused a physical response, which made them true. So we talked about heroes and symbols. So now the last thing that we really need to talk about, which is sort of the tour de force concept of Walter Lippmann, is the pseudo-environment. Now, people interact with their environment, and as we've mentioned, they do so imperfectly. What does that mean? Well, if people interacted perfectly with their environment, there would be no need for things like hypothesizing. You wouldn't need to think about how something would work and then plan to experiment with it and then test it several times and then see how it actually did go if you could perfectly interact with your environment. We need to constantly try new things, come up with new ideas, make different attempts before we can really even glean the smallest semblance of the reality of the environment that we live in. And this is with the parts of the environment that we can interact with. Now, with the parts of the environment that we can't interact with, all that we can rely on are these different kinds of mental images. So when people have a mental image, a picture, a news story, a video, and that is internalized and brings about an emotional response, the people are not reacting to the actual environment because they aren't there. They are reacting to a self-created pseudo-environment. The pseudo-environment of Iraq in the beginning would have been something like glorious liberators going into this destitute country to save them from a dictator. And as it came to an end, the pseudo-environment quickly changed to reflect imperialism and imposition of ideas against a culture that wasn't necessarily open to having them brought down upon them. So the pseudo-environment, the environment is the encapsulation of the private life. It is your ability to interact with what you know. In the modern world, we are a specialized society, so each person tends to have a specialized way of interacting with their environment, drawing conclusions, performing experiments to better themselves and to more readily understand their environment. But outside of the confines of the environment which each person is capable of interacting with, there's a much larger world. And because we need to know about this much larger world in order to affect public policy and public affairs, we necessarily must create some sort of image of the environment outside of our environment. And while this pseudo-environment is itself a fiction, it does directly interact with the environments of other people because it produces, as we've mentioned, an emotional response which triggers some need to either relieve or to reinforce the emotion felt, which translates itself into some sort of tangible process. So there is a triangle relationship. Hopefully I'll get one up there for you. between 1, the scene of the action, 2, the human picture of the scene, and 3, the human response to the picture. And these 3 things are not static. When the scene of the action is shown to people that aren't there, that have no experience, and that's simply encapsulated as a picture, it creates this picture in their head. This picture is of their pseudo-environment, of a place which they have no experience. And from this picture, they draw an emotional response. This emotional response is fed into some sort of tangible, physical call to action, vote, demand, any kind of action like that, which in turn creates a new scene of action. And the new scene of action creates a new human picture of that scene. That new human picture of that scene creates a new human response to the new picture, which in turn creates a new scene of action. And so this is sort of how people in the modern world navigate through their pseudo-environment to steer their ideas, their concepts, and the pictures in their head towards other areas and other places, things, and ideas which they do not themselves interact with, and come to form public ideas, public affairs, and public opinions. So just to close out, I've mentioned 3 words, and 2 of them sound like the same word, so I just want to go ahead and define them because it will be useful for continuing our conversations. The first being public affairs. Public affairs, it's a pretty simple concept. The features of the world outside which have to do with the behavior of other humans. So the public affairs of the United States are who are we going to trade with? What should our policy be for this nation that does this thing? It's attempting to interact with an environment outside of what you're physically capable of doing and attempting to orient yourself in the world. Public affairs are the affairs of the public, the government being a public institution, what affairs the government should take. Simply enough. Then the next one that, which is actually sort of the topic of this video, is public opinions. And public opinions in this case are going to be lowercase. When our public affairs determine that we need to have some sort of interaction with another country, the images inside of those people's heads are their public opinions. Our public opinions are what we think on a grand scale, or lowercase is more on the individual scale, of the actual environment outside of our experience. So public affairs are what we should do with things outside of our actual experience. Public opinions are the images in our head which lead us to believe that we should engage in some sort of public affair. And then that leads us to public opinions capitalized. And so if public opinions lowercase is the image in the head of the person, public opinions capitalized is the physical response from the emotion of the lowercase public opinions. So public affairs are necessarily what we think about the environment outside of us. Public opinions are the images that give us the public affairs, and public opinion capitalized is the action that we take to make the 2 concepts correspond with one another. Alright, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. This is a series that I'm actually very excited to do. It's going to lead us into a lot of different kinds of topics that we can look at. Like I mentioned earlier, it might seem like I kind of went over a lot of things quickly, but I'm more trying to lay out the process of what the next couple of parts of this episode are going to look at. We're going to go much more in detail into just about everything that we talked about. And then the last part will look specifically at what the effect of public opinion on a democracy is and how it comes to dictate the way that that government works. So I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to leave a like. If you want to see more like this, make sure to subscribe. But until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.